What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to the Homebrewed Christianity podcast, bringing you some ideological ingredients to brew your own faith. Today on the podcast is not just the editor-in-chief of Christianity Today, not just the author of Karl Barth, an introductory biography for evangelicals, but a homebrewer. Yeah, that's what you'll end up finding out in this conversation, that Mark Galli at Homebrewed Christianity, we're talking about his book. We get off of topic from talking about Karl Barth, and then we end up talking about Rob Bell, the task of preaching evangelical support of Donald Trump, whether or not the evangelicals are down, if they love Barth, to go along with his democratic socialism, how personal life affects how the way we hear and read theologians, the division and polarizing tendencies of politics and religion today. But most importantly, Mark and I have a significant discussion about the basic foundational elements to homebrewing, how not to really be bad at homebrewing. That happens at the end. I hope you enjoy the conversation. It was a whole bunch of fun. And if you're like me and you grew up in a more evangelical environment, and wonder whether or not you have a place in evangelicalism, you might be a bit disappointed because, Mark's pretty clear on the boundaries for evangelicalism. Just tell me what you think about them, but I'm still gonna read the Bible and pray a lot and have Jesus-shaped piety, even if you can't be an evangelical if you're open and affirming, but maybe when I'm in Chicago, he and I will get to have some beer he brewed and talk about it. All right? Now, before we jump into this episode, remember the Advent class for Homebrewed Christianity that we're doing with John Pavlovich and Michael Morrell is about to start. That's right. Make Advent Great Again. Go to makeadventgreatagain.com. You can join. You can join for free or donate whatever you want. But join. Over 4,000 people have already signed up. You get daily written reflections throughout Advent. You get a weekly video live interaction, and then you get a bunch of surprise midweek video interactions as well. It is a online pop-up community of people looking for sanity, an oasis of sanity in this crazy, crazy time in the United States of America. The war on Advent is started up. Christmas is already creeping into Advent. We need to resist it. That's right. Boom. Before we get into the interview, I just want to give a shout out to all the Homebrewed Christianity community members, the people who donate each and every month to keep Homebrewed Christianity going, alive and well. If you want to be one of those elect members, you can go to homebrewedcommunity.com and join up. And I want to tell you right now, when the new year comes, there's an entire new website and all sorts of new excitement for our Homebrewed Christianity members. And you'll be getting an announcement about the Homebrewed Christianity 10th birthday party, beer camps coming in 2018, all that and more right when we kick off the new year. I think we're going to do it at an Epiphanation. If you weren't a Homebrew listener last year or around then, on the day of Epiphany, that would be the day in the church calendar, like, the 12 days of Christmas in, when you celebrate the arrival of the Magi, the wise men showing up with little gifts for baby JC. When we celebrate that day, their epiphany that Jesus is King and Herodism, the Homebrewed community had a special, 3-hour podcast where members joined in for 10 minutes and we talked about whatever they wanted while doing a beer tasting over the 3 hours. And by the end, it was partisan NBA talk where I was taunting people that were fans of Mouthpiece and Golden State Warriors. And it's a Steph Curry joke if you don't listen to the NBA or pay attention to it. And maybe a little taunting towards the Spurs and Golden State and the Thunder. That's what happened. But Epiphanation's happening again. And during Epiphanation, we're going to be talking about all the stuff for 2018 and everything for Homebrewed Christianity. Exciting announcements. But I'm not supposed to say anything else right now. All right? So, join the community. Be a part of Homebrewed Christianity. And our friends John and Mike putting together Make Advent Great Again. It's an amazing group of people contributing each day throughout Advent. And I will see you soon. Maybe maybe on December 7th in Winston-Salem at Wake Forest University Divinity School for a live podcast with Bill Leonard. Maybe on December 8th, maybe there at Christ King Lutheran Church in Cary, North Carolina. That would be Raleigh-Durham, Chapel Hill area. Or maybe on the 16th in D.C. with my friends from Crackers and Grape Juice and Diana Butler Bass. On the 16th, I'm preaching at Aldersgate United Methodist in that Saturday evening. And then that night, we got holiday cocktails and a live podcast with Diana Butler Bass in Washington, D.C. So get on it and come see me. And if you want to have the podcast come to your area or want me to come talk or speak at your school or your church or your group of nerds, then holler at me. trip@homebrewedchristianity.com. All right, here we go. Mark, going to talk about Karl Barth, a bunch of other stuff, and then homebrewing. All right, enjoy. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity. This is Trip, and today we're going to be talking to Mark about his new book, Karl Barth, An Introductory Biography for Evangelicals. And on top of writing a book that is readable and under 9,000 pages about Karl Barth, you're also the editor-in-chief at Christianity Today, written a whole stack of books. So I think the best place to begin is how does someone end up an editor-in-chief at Christianity Today? That is very different than ending up a professor or something like this. Tell us how in your own life and your vocational journey you end up being a chief.
There you go. That's a good question. It's a mystery to me, and it makes me believe in the providence of God, because I didn't study journalism. I started out as pastor, Presbyterian pastor, and my last gig was at a small church in Sacramento. As a pastor, I started writing for Leadership Journal, which is what a journal we used to own here at Christianity Today. At one point, I was hoping that the editor would write me and ask me to write a cover story. I thought that would be awesome. And he ended up offering me a job as an associate editor. So even though that at that moment it wasn't a good fit, about 6 months later it was, and I ended up coming on staff and found out that I was a pretty good editor. I didn't know this. I had this talent or gift, and I kept getting promoted. And eventually I got moved to Christianity Today, the magazine, and became managing editor. And then when the time came, I became editor-in-chief. So believe it, yeah, I'm as surprised as anyone else that I'm doing this, because it wasn't like I had this 20-year plan to be here. It's just, here I am. I could do no other.
So how would you describe where Christianity Today is in the publishing industry and its place in the church? And because the book itself is written as a biographical introduction for Barth, but for evangelicals. And I think that's a politically charged word. It's a confusing word. And since you're an editor-in-chief and clearly must edit it so it's perfectly clear all the time, maybe you can kind of locate Christianity Today in the unique place we're at in American religion.
Well, we understand evangelical, like you suggested, there's different levels of understanding. There's a purely cultural level, and this is the level, cultural and political level, that most of the American public seems to recognize as evangelical. It mostly has to do with evangelicals think politically. They're, in fact, if a pollster asks questions of an evangelical, they're not interested in their views of Christ's divinity or their views on evangelism. They're only interested in their views on some political issue. So it gives the impression that evangelicals are primarily a political movement with a religious beneath. But evangelicals tend to be people that are primarily interested in loving and serving Jesus Christ. They wake up in the morning, they have a devotion, they try to figure out how they're going to be a good father or mother or husband or wife. They probably have to go to a Christian ed meeting in the evening. They're figuring out if they're playing in the worship band on Sunday. In other words, their life is centered around Jesus Christ. And when someone sticks a microphone in their face and says, "What do you think about immigration?" Well, they're American. They have an opinion. But that isn't necessarily what defines them. So it's that person underneath their political opinion that what we're interested in ministering to. So that includes everyone across the spectrum politically. But then as you just think about it more and more theologically and spiritually, it has to do with people who more or less fit in with the famous Betty Claude Bible rule. Crucicentric, the biblicentric, the activist, the conversionist. I myself add a few other things on top of that to kind of define them more specifically. Even though there was a recent blog that basically said we should abort the word evangelical, it doesn't have any meaning anymore. I see this kind of Christianity being evident all through Christian history. It's what Perry Miller calls the Augustinian mood, or an Augustinian piety. So you can get rid of the word evangelical if you like, but there is a spirituality and a way of preaching Christian life that's not going anywhere. So we have to have a word for it. And that's the perennial mood, or subjective mood, Perry Miller calls it, way of being a Christian. Pietism would be probably the major historical expression. That's what we try to minister to. Both the cultural expression of evangelicals in America today, but then also this expression that goes back at least to Augustine.
Mm-hmm. So when were you first introduced or got excited about engaging Karl Barth's work?
Probably in undergrad work. I took a class in the religious studies department at UC Santa Cruz, and it was on 20th century theology. So we read Bultmann, Bonhoeffer, Brunner, Martin Buber, and others. And we read Barth's Epistle to the Romans. I can't remember if we were required to read the whole thing. I can assure you I did not read the whole thing when I was an undergraduate. But I found him so bracing, that book especially. I love extremists because you know exactly where they stand. And Barth is the extremist in his Epistle to the Romans. And it's captivated me. And I've read it on and off through the years. I remember sitting in a coffee shop in Santa Cruz when my brother and I were taking a trip there once, later in life, and just coming to tears over a passage that he had read there because it was so powerful, so moving. So then I studied him in seminary a bit, although not very extensively. And it's been an on and off relationship with Barth through the years until I was forced to spend a considerable amount of time putting this book together.
Mm-hmm. So when you go to start writing this book, what is this something a publisher comes to you and Erdman's is like, how would we introduce Barth to evangelicals? Or is it a topic that has come up consistently in your editorial work where you go and want to investigate and introduce them? Or what was that origin moment of the time and dedication it takes for someone who, wasn't forced to read large amounts of Karl Barth for their qualifying exams like me into figuring out how you're going to introduce him?
Well, I was actually approached by a fairly conservative evangelical publishing house whose name I'll leave out, even though they come out looking pretty good at the end of the story. Because they were aware, they were kind of debating about how they wanted to shift their publishing efforts, and they were aware that a number of evangelical scholars had been influenced by Barth. Barth was in the conversation, theological conversation among evangelicals more and more. So they thought an introductory biography of Barth for evangelicals might be helpful. So I said, I could do that. When I wrote the book and presented it to the publisher, the man I was working with basically said, well, we can't publish that. You have to be more critical, especially on this one point. That is to say, this publishing comes out of a revivalist history, which means that the sinner's prayer and this moment of confession of faith actually does something to change God's mind about you. It does something. And of course, Barth, that's just for Barth. It's like, it is finished on the cross. Faith is nothing more than an acknowledgement that what God has done. And I told them, I can criticize Barth for a lot of things. I'm just not going to criticize him about that, because I think that's one of the weaknesses of evangelicalism now, is we think we actually make a difference in God's mind. I think that's terrible. So we had a very amicable discussion over 2 or 3 emails, and they were very gracious. Said, well, we can't publish it. I said, I get it. I mean, I don't want you to publish something you don't agree with. And I thought, since they'd already paid me part of my advance, we were done. And he said, well, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll pay you a kill fee, and then we'll just end the contract. And I thought that was very gracious of them, on top of what they'd already paid me, because it was my responsibility to submit a publishable manuscript, and I hadn't done that. Not for lack of effort, but just because we had a disagreement. So then I ended up shopping it around to some other publishers, and Erdman's finally picked it up. So that's kind of how it got started. And I think the reason I agreed to do it, because I've been asked to do other biographies that I've turned down for different reasons. I was asked one by a publishing house to do a biography of Martin Luther King Jr., and I just thought, I just think I'm the guy to do. I think it would be really interesting, but I really do think, all things being equal, you need someone else to do this than me. But the Barth one was because of my lifelong attraction to him. I thought that would be really interesting to do that. And so, being that my specialty as a scholar, in air quotes, is that I don't know that I've ever done any original research on anything that isn't anything longer than that. But I seem to be pretty good at taking what experts have done and then translating that for a lay audience. And so this was a perfect opportunity to practice that.
So when you're going into beginning the work on this book, like, what are the particular topics, themes, ideas that are out of Karl Barth's work that are seen or received as controversial for the evangelical audience you're wanting to introduce them to? Because I can imagine they're different than when I'm taking a Barth seminar at a mainline Protestant school.
Well, actually, what I wanted to do was more positive at the beginning. I knew I was going to have to address the controversial things, his with his assistant, his flirtation with universalism, his doctrine of Scripture were probably the three biggest things that a typical evangelical would balk at. But I wasn't like, I need to tell people why they can read him despite this. What I wanted to tell people, and why I wanted to write a biography of Barth rather than just an introduction to his theology, was because I don't think most people are aware of this really interesting set of arcs in his life in which he comes up against the dominant ideology of his day, which we now label 19th century liberal. And not quite single-handedly, but almost single-handedly, turn the conversation of theology in a completely different direction, or at least large parts of it. Then he does the same thing in the sense of he confronts this other massive ideology called fascism in the persona of Adolf Hitler. And he is one of the few people in Germany that actually confronts the fascist ideology strongly and theologically. And he gets exiled for that as well. And I just thought, the writer, those are two really good stories. They have a beginning, middle, and end. They have a conflict. They have a dramatic moment. And if nothing else, it should make for great reading. In fact, in my first draft, basically, after he was exiled to Basel, I ended the book because I thought after that, he's just a theologian. He sits in his office. He writes lectures. He goes to meetings. He goes to World Council churches. He gives lectures. That's just boring. That doesn't have a narrative arc to it. But, of course, my first reader that came through said, you can't just skip that part of his life. I said, okay, fair enough. So I went back and did that. But I would say the narrative interest in the book really finishes after his exile to Basel. And that's what I wanted to tell people, that Barth is a great thinker, but he's a man of courage. And that's something we ought to be aware of as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things about Karl Barth that I've always appreciated is while he is critical and direct with his criticisms towards 19th century liberalism, he was also a good student of it. Like, he really understood it, engaged it, and that's often not the experience or pattern for your theological foe that birthed you. So can you describe like Karl Barth's kind of relationship to the church and faith and theological reflection, where he comes up in this this ideology that he then ends up critiquing?
Yeah, so he is nurtured by Schleiermacher and von Harnack and William Herman, among others. And of course, they deeply disappoint him with their championing Germany's entrance into World War I, and that completely devastates him. And he's very it seems to be very hostile to them for some time. By the time, I think a very interesting anecdote is by the time we see the end of World War II, he has a more appreciative stance toward this whole thing. And in fact, I can't remember when he wrote these letters, but he is, I think it's even in the 1930s, he's already expressing dismay at his students who have nothing good to say about 19th century liberals. And he says, Well, that isn't quite what I meant to impart. I wanted to suggest that their theological direction was wrong, but we just can't throw them all out as if they're worthless. I forget who he writes that to. And then at the end of World War II, he gives these lectures back in Germany. I believe it's in some church or chapel that's still showing evidence of having been ruined in a bombing. And he discovers a bust of Schleiermacher that's still intact. And he picks it up and he takes it and he puts it back in his office. Because as much as he disagreed with Schleiermacher's, certainly his theology and his methodology, he respected him as a great thinker, as a man who tried to at least unravel the mysteries of the Christian faith. And that is one thing I discovered in reading this, is how appreciative he could be of people he deeply disagreed with. In fact, he had friendships with Tillich and Bultmann his whole life, inviting them into his home. I would have loved to have been a mouse sitting and listening to their conversation. But you don't think of Barth as inviting Bultmann or Tillich into his home to discuss the public disagreement.
Well, I wonder how much of that has to do with how Barth is received and experienced in America and American evangelicalism in particular versus the way evangelicals or Protestant theological reflection takes place in Europe.
Yeah, it could be. Since I don't, you do get the impression that, well, of course, there were some bitter animosities between him and Bruner, for example, for a long time. So it isn't like everybody was able to put aside things personal and then sit around and have a beer together and talk about theology. But it does seem to be more the case that, in my impression, that's more the case that you can sit down and have a vigorous but nonetheless amicable conversation with people with whom you disagree theologically about fairly substantial things and keep a relationship going, more so than you can, certainly among your everyday evangelicalism, which once one discovers that your theology is corrupt in some significant way, it's just very difficult to keep having a conversation for whatever reason.
Well, how much of when you give the example of Barth pulling out the Schleiermacher bust and even some of the commonalities between them both, like they were both as much preachers and ministers as they were theologians. Like both Barth and Schleiermacher had a commitment to the church. They both have a very strong personal piety that was known to their students and those close to them and things. But today, I don't experience those type of friendships or that type of respect existing among that big a diversity in American Christian theology. That something about the way we see the church, our identities, and our theological reflection doesn't lead to a lot of friendships and respect across that big a theological distance. Do you have any idea where that has emerged since Barth?
That's a really good question, man. In terms of its source, I don't know what to say to that other than the thing I thought of when you mentioned that was how it used to be the case in the United States Congress that people from differing parties could, after arguing with each other in the Senate or the House of Representatives, could then go out and have lunch together, or they'd go out to dinner with each other's wives and talk. That no longer happens. I don't know if there's a shift of that in other spheres, in the sphere of academia, certainly in theology, if that's been a shift as well, or it's always been true that it's been difficult to talk to one another. I don't know, but it is something I'm personally concerned about as editor of Christianity Today, and as I look at the state of the church, I just feel like that's a really bad development. The worse that gets, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the interesting things I think about this book and Karl Barth in general is some of the theological issues that, let's say, as if you were a member of the Evangelical Theological Society, right? Like if you are arguing for, if the open theists experience this kind of like intense criticism, as opposed to recognize them as like a brother or sister in Christ with difference, and yet issues like that you brought up, even around the original publisher wanting like, well, where's the sinner's prayer thing in here? And that's really not how Barth frames the doctrine of election and salvation. I think a conversation, or one of the things that we can do, is it really opens up the wideness or the diversity or multiplicity of Christian theologians confessing their faith in Christ, and it taking different shapes, yet having integrity out of the person in their own piety and such. And maybe that's a gift to bring to our contemporary kind of polarization.
Yeah, I suppose one reason is that evangelicals as such are very mission-minded. They're very focused that it's that active action part of the quadrilateral. And I suppose it would be interesting to do a study that the people that are more interested in intertheological dialogue, I suspect, now this might be a judgment that I'm just really going to regret later. I suspect the more you're into dialogue and mutual exchange of ideas, the less passionate you're about some sort of concrete, narrow, focused mission. And I think there might be something in the evangelical DNA that just says, dialogue is all well and good, but if I'm having to spend my time talking and listening to someone who disagrees with me about something significant, it's not only going to make me upset, it's going to make me it's going to be less focused on the thing I need to do, which is either work for racial reconciliation or spread the gospel. So there is this impatience in evangelical DNA with such dialogue for various reasons, but I think one of them is because of this notion that we have to get on with the business of Jesus. Not recognizing that maybe one of the businesses of Jesus is theological conversation.
Well, I mean, that might be a good place for you to speak a bit about how Karl Barth kind of reinterprets the Reformed tradition, that his understanding of election and the divine yes and no, the yes and no of God is more his preoccupation than an individual's yes and no at a particular time to just that individual's relationship with Christ.
Yeah, so he basically centers a lot of his theology around the doctrine of election, and the doctrine of election is not about whether you or I or any individual is elect or damned. It's about whether, in fact, the entire human race is elect or damned, and in Christ, the entire human race summed up. And so the entire human race is damned, in fact, in Christ, crucified on the cross. And the entire human race, therefore, is elect in Christ. It's an interesting point of view that has made me think, is that really a reform? He comes out of the Reformed tradition. He identifies with the Reformed tradition. But it makes me wonder, has he essentially adopted a doctrine or a way of understanding all this that is more Arminian? That is to say, everyone, in fact, is saved by the cross of Christ. It might be, I don't understand the fine points of Arminianism, but our Arminian friend Roger Olson is puzzled about that. Why isn't this called Arminianism instead of Reformed theology? But I do think from a Reformed perspective, it's a fresh way to talk about God's initiative in salvation for the whole human race. And our only response is one of either accepting that reality or rejecting that reality. It's unclear whether Barth thinks anyone can eventually reject it or not. I think he actually says that in parts. But the point being, it keeps the emphasis on the sovereignty of God, the initiative of God, that we really didn't have a whole lot of say in the matter whether we were going to be elected or not. We are. So now the question is, what are you going to do about it?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things, I mean, there's a couple issues end up coming up when you first encounter this picture from Barth for kind of the normative assumptions in American religion. Like there's this assumption of an individual's kind of willed response. There's an assumption of kind of no post-mortem opportunities for continued reconciliation. I remember growing up where people debated the age of accountability and these type of things. And the way we discuss salvation in American religion is so shaped by the piety and practices of the Great Awakenings here in the United States, right, that I think sometimes we don't ask those questions in the face of the context in which Barth does. And you kind of talk about the way in which, not only is he picking up a historically larger or bigger conversation around election and such, he also is talking about the God who loves in freedom in the middle and post Holocaust. And to narrow things to an individual's response or in this one life and stuff, when you are looking and you're standing in the shadow of Auschwitz, is a lot harder to do. And so the context for his battle, both with, kind of the inherited 19th century liberalism, but also fascism and the problem of, anti-Semitism and this revelation of the violence at the heart of humanity, I think reframes the context for thinking about salvation and mission.
Yeah, I do think the weakness of an evangelical way of approaching these things, which is very much centered on the individual decision. On one level, it can turn into something that's really parochial and seems very private, personal, and really doesn't seem to engage with larger movements that you're talking about, that we are required as responsible Christians in the world to ponder and think about, pray about, theologize about. On the other hand, of course, there is this profound and deep philosophical approach to life called existentialism, which basically says, yeah, all well and good that we have all these grand movements and narratives going on, but when push comes to shove, it's the individual who has to deal with the absolute in the end. So I think that's when we can put evangelicalism in that context, I think it's a more noble enterprise. It has a very powerful and big philosophical underpinning in that regard. But I will admit, as editor-in-chief of Christianity Today, and as I observe the evangelical movement, that lends itself on a day-to-day basis into a kind of parochialism and privatized religion that makes it difficult for evangelicals to engage in anything beyond their very local sphere. And I think that harms us, especially when we come up against cultural forces like we are today. We have no way of actually processing them very fully or very deeply. You see that, for example, when we come up against great social injustices like racism and racial injustice and structural injustice, or we come up against the immigration, how to deal with immigration issues. How many millions of people in the world are moving from one country to another? This is a huge world issue. And the most we can do when we start to talk about it is to say, well, in the Old Testament, it says we're supposed to welcome the sojourner. Okay, I get it, but have we nothing more profound to say than that? And we usually don't, unfortunately.
So when you think through that, the two big battles with ideologies, like what are the things that were hard earned and won in Barth's life and reflection that you're wanting to hand to evangelicals today as they engage his own story?
Well, I think the biggest one is, and unfortunately there's an event in his private life which seems to be a complete denial of this. Maybe we'll get to that in this conversation. But what I appreciate about him is that he wants to ground our theological reflection and our Christian life in the revelation of Jesus Christ as it comes to us from the outside, particularly as it comes to us through the witness of Scripture. That is to say, the truth of the gospel is something that happens outside of us, and it is communicated to us from the outside toward us. Now, this is a direct attack or disagreement with Schleiermacher, who said religion is primarily a feeling of dependence. It has to do with what's going on inside us. That's how we can identify truth that's separated from error. That's how we can decide where God is in our life, where He's leading us. To that, Barth said the decisive no. I think he's agreeing with Feuerbach there, who basically said, well, if Schleiermacher's right, then I can't imagine how God can be anything but wish fulfillment. And Barth says, you're right. If that's the way we're going to do things, you can't tell the difference. But if you ground it in the revelation of Jesus Christ that comes from outside us, then we might have a better chance of moving forward. So I think evangelicalism needs to hear that message, because we are a movement. We are a pietistic movement. That is to say, emotion, internal, listening to the Spirit, what the Spirit teaches us and directs us and guides us, is part and parcel of who we are. We cannot pretend we're not that. Our experience of faith begins, at least archetypal, in terms of the archetype. We must be born again. It's not just a verbal decision, something changes in it. And we go on to have what we call a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. So the subjective part of it is very important to us. But if left unchecked, it ends up with what I'd call it's a very, what to me is a thin faith that cannot then step back and see, and in many cases, evil for what it is. So the two examples would be the German theologians who get swept up in this moment of patriotism in the 1940s, and they equate that with the will of God for Germany. It happens in the 1930s when Hitler is a magnificent orator and galvanizes the people, gives them a sense of self-esteem like they hadn't had in decades, and people, good, solid Christian people, begin to equate that euphoria with the movement of the Spirit. And Barth said, without there being this revelation that comes to us from the outside, we have in a sense, we lose our free will and we get sucked up into it, and we can't actually judge it for what it is. And so I do think evangelicals run into that problem. I wrote a book about that regarding Rob Bell, who's a very fine evangelical preacher, still a very quite effective preacher, very powerful communicator. He says a lot of things that I listen to and I go, wow, that's pretty interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way. I think I might even agree with that. But he's definitely moved away from classical Orthodox Christianity, primarily because he seems to be driven by this kind of subjective mood that I think is unchecked. So I do think Barth can help us stay in the classical Orthodox tradition of Christianity, enjoying the subjective, but having a check on it. And I do think right now we could use a check.
So I mean, in thinking about that, like, how would you correlate the church leaders who get caught up in this patriotism and go along with ideology and leaders that are affront to the gospel, and like people like Falwell and all the support for Trump and the best evangelical turnout in an election for someone that doesn't think he has anything to repent for and brags about sexual assault and all that kind of stuff. Like I could imagine someone listening to this and going, oh, good, he's writing a book to kind of tell evangelicals, like, maybe you want to stick. Like, God's otherness is one that probably doesn't wear a Make America Great Again hat.
Well, actually, there's 2 chapters in here, in the book, one called Resistance and one called Barman, that if people read it, they're going to think it's an implicit critique of the evangelical followers of Trump. But I have to assure readers, I wrote this 4 years before the last year's election.
So it's prophecy.
They're completely accidental. But there does seem to be some parallels, although the more you analyze, the more you actually talk to evangelicals who voted for Trump or who are basically sympathetic to his political plans, the more you realize they find his personal behavior disgusting. They find his mouth uncontrolled. They don't have much respect for him in terms of his character, but they do happen to agree with some of his policies. So I think that's one thing. I don't know that a typical evangelical who supports Trump's policies is that as swept up in Trump like the German Christians were swept up in the personality of Hitler. I think that's a false comparison.
So what do you think about his policies makes him more attractive, like getting a higher percentage of the vote and turnout than any of the previous 6 Republicans that ran?
But it's not that much higher. I mean, the other 6 Republicans were in the range of 75 to 77% turnout for Republicans. For Trump, it was 81%, but then it's only 81% of people who voted.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that there's a lot of evangelicals didn't vote, and we assume they were discussing with both Trump and Hillary. So that is needs more, a little more digging for us to figure out what's going on. What I have seen since is, surprisingly, a poll that came out not too many months afterwards asking evangelicals why they voted for Trump. The thing that surprised me, I thought it would have been his promise to a Supreme Court judge who was more conservative on abortion.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it might be religious freedom issues related to gay rights. But it turns out that the major reason was jobs. They just felt he had a better, for right or wrong, they believed that he could turn things around and create more jobs for Americans. But the other two were still pretty important as well. So I think the religious freedom issue, the right to be able to practice your faith in the way you want to practice it in the public square, which means for some people, it means they cannot bake a cake for a gay wedding. I think that's a visceral issue for many evangelicals. I think the notion of abortion obviously is still, when I talk to evangelicals who supported Trump and I talk about some of my concerns, the vehemence with which vehemence isn't the right word, the passion with which they want to defend the life of the unborn, refreshingly surprises me. These men and women really care deeply about that issue. So I think to understand the evangelical vote for Trump is a little more complicated than we imagined. I happen to be a more moderate person, so I disagree with a lot of their political judgments, but I'm not prepared to say that they're rooting for Trump is because they somehow swept up into Trump mania in the way that makes them idolatrous.
Well, so what do you think they would? What do you think evangelicals would respond if Karl Barth sat down and gave them a lesson on the superiority of democratic socialism for Bible-believing Christians?
They wouldn't be too impressed.
I know, but his arguments, at least early Karl Barth arguments, I was surprised come out of he was a minister, right? Like with working class people and stuff, yeah. And the origins of his, he would have been much closer to Bernie Sanders than anyone that was running.
In fact, I think he gets critiqued in the 50s because he hammers on the United States for its capitalism, for its proliferation of nuclear arms. And he says relatively little about the oppression going on in communist countries. And he has his rationale for it, but I can't help think. But he's basically a socialist at heart. And he just has a hard time criticizing socialists and further left governments. He is deeply socialist, no question about it. Yeah.
So would you say both like there in the political situation along with in his kind of picture of salvation being more about like God's sovereignty and such, that the horizon of his theological reflection and political reflection is just much broader than the way Americans in general, but also evangelical Americans tend to kind of shape the scope of their reflection?
Yeah, that's really interesting. In fact, in what you were saying, maybe you were implying it, but it occurred to me that I didn't think about how his attraction to socialism is very similar to his attraction to a theology that encompasses the whole, rather than a focus on the individual. And in fact, when he gets to the individual, he does struggle. I'm reading through his second volume of the volume 4 reconciliation, and I don't think he's at his best when he starts talking about the individual. He just really struggles to try to understand what happens on a personal level, how this all confronts the individual human being. That's not his strong suit, apparently.
Well, and I think part of it is like that for Karl Barth, theology was always so much about God that even the ideas of individuals, their own experience, recognition, and such, and participation in salvation was always framed in a covenantal relationship. And for Barth, the covenantal relationship with Israel is primary, but also that covenant is nested in God's covenant with creation. And those covenantal relationships are much more communal and at the level of the collective than any particular individual.
Yeah, and so when he introduces a topic, from my reading. I'm now going to talk about how this intersects, how this works in the life of an individual between now and the second coming. How do we live that out today? And then he says, but before we can do that, we have to talk about some grand theme, usually the covenant in one form or another. And he spends pages and pages setting up the context again before getting back to the point. So I think you're absolutely right about that. He just refuses to talk about the individual without bringing it into this larger context, time and time again. And he's very repetitive about the way he does theology.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, he did not have an editor.
He needed an editor. I can tell you that right now. It makes sometimes reading him a little easier because I'm going to sections. I think he said this already. I kind of skim till I can find something to say fresh.
So, how has like Karl Barth's own kind of edgy lifestyle create how he's heard or not heard in evangelicals in the evangelical environment?
Well, that'll be interesting to see. I mean, I think there has been a distrust of him because he had this affair, certainly an emotional affair with Charlotte von Kirschbaum, his assistant. There seems to be more evidence than ever that it was actually more also physical as well. And that doesn't set well with evangelicals because sexual morality is a very important issue with us for reasons that I think are not just puritanical, but I think there's kind of a deep understanding of how important human sexuality is, how crucial it is to our identity, and that this must not be tampered with lightly at all. So when they find out that there's someone who has committed some sort of sexual indiscretion, some sexual sin, they're immediately deeply suspicious of them, and they want nothing to do with it. So a typical example day to day would be Pastor Smith. He's a great pastor. He has all these lectures on YouTube, and he has all these downloads. You can go to his website. Great teachings about grace, about the gospel, about the cross. We discover he has had an adulterous relationship with his music director. The next question that evangelicals ask is, should we continue to download his podcasts? Should we continue to download his lectures, his sermons, etc.? Has that completely disqualified him from even teaching us in any other form? That's how powerful this is. So for our movement. Now, we have had this happen. Unfortunately, it happens fairly regularly. So we've had opportunity to address that in Christianity Today. Whenever this happens, we have to do the perennial essay on, can we still listen to this person? And of course, the way Christianity Today comes down on it is that yes, we can. Even if the behavior seems to undermine the very point the pastor, the theologian, was trying to make, that might be all the more reason to dig into his theology. So the example on Karl Barth is he has this relationship with Charlotte, and what stunned me and surprised me and deeply saddened me was the recent revelation of his justification for that affair, lifelong affair, where he not only has the affair, he tells his wife about it. He not only tells his wife about it, he says, I want this woman to live in our home because she's a personal assistant and I can't work without her. He takes her on trips by himself when he wants a retreat, not with his wife. So this is like behavior that's just beyond the pale as far as I'm concerned. But it's his justification of it. When push comes to shove, he says things like, this is the devil because essentially it feels so good and so right, which is Schleiermachian subjectivism at its worst. In other words, there must be something true and right about this because it feels true and right, rather than trying to look at something outside of himself, the revelation of God in Jesus Christ, and maybe the commandment of God that says do not commit adultery, that stands apart from us and judges us from the outside. He's unable to do that. So at one level you think this discredits his whole theology. To me it's like, oh my gosh, it just shows how important it is for us to be fresh about the really good that comes to us. Because even a person who is committed to it as Karl Barth was, it's just really hard to not let your emotions start to dictate what you actually think is true or not. So that's how we try to address this anomaly between the theologian or pastor's personal behavior and what he or she teaches.
Did y'all have like the same type of article on whether or not you can vote for Trump? Like, third marriage in Playboy videos, 13 outstanding sexual assault charges, like.
We didn't actually have a debate, but that was one of the issues at play. So, obviously, unfortunately, politics was the determining factor on how you came down on that. So, if you didn't like Trump's policies, and you use that as to criticize any Christian that supported him, by saying, how could you, as a Christian, support a man who had forces, grabs women inappropriately, speaks derogatorily about them? You call yourself a Christian, you voted for him, and then the Christians who voted for him saying, well, I think that stuff's kind of disgusting too, but I'm not voting for pastor-in-chief. I'm voting for a president who is supporting policies I happen to agree with. So that there was no real intelligent discussion about that. It was more driven by partisan politics.
Well, I was just interested in the switch in whether or not morality is important for your your politicians, and wondering if the same type of thing is going to be more prevalent for your minister or your theologian or your doctor. That over a rather quick time, conservative, politically leaning people, and also more religiously or higher rates of practicing their religion, morality doesn't matter as much for their voting. Like, do you think like Karl Barth people are probably less likely now culturally to be as worried about Karl Barth's lifelong love affair type thing?
Hard to say. Theoretically, yes, but evangelicals, like everybody else, are fairly self-serving. So when it serves their interest to criticize Bill Clinton for sexual indiscretions because they happen to disagree with his policies, they'll do that. And when they have a Donald Trump whose policies they like, they will overlook morality. I wouldn't be surprised if in 10 or 20 years some other issue comes up in which they are fiercely criticizing someone for their morality in leadership, but really what's going on underneath is actually a disagreement with policy and politics. Mm-hmm. I'm not surprised that evangelicals are hypocrites about that, because we're all hypocrites about stuff like that. But it is sad. It happens so. For people like me, it seemed like it was yesterday we were criticizing Bill Clinton for being an immoral leader. That was a big deal to us. Now it doesn't seem to be something many conservative evangelicals are much worried about. They'll say it in private. I will give them that. Anytime I've had a private conversation with a Trump supporter, they make no bones about the fact that they do not defend his behavior or his language. But I don't see many conservative evangelicals criticizing him publicly in that way, mm-hmm. who are nonetheless supportive of his policies. If there are conservative evangelicals who are not supportive of him, who don't have a problem with criticizing him, but that's the minority.
Mm-hmm. So when what do you think would be necessary, or what kind of situation we need to get to where the church became not the place we turned up those kind of hypocritical, polarizing intensities and things like that, but a community where our shared identity in baptism and Christ's table and things like that gave us the patience and grace to have a different type of dialogue and conversation and reflection?
Yeah, I think I don't know if that's going to be possible until we have a shift in technology. And what I mean is this. I actually think that sort of thing was more possible before the age of Twitter and Facebook, and before there was this deep political division and cultural division in America. I do remember being parts of congregations in which there were Democrats and Republicans who actually worshiped together and who thought their greatest political act every week was to announce that Jesus is Lord again. I think that's harder and harder to do now because of the divisiveness of American life, so that I say it in my own movement. evangelicalism, how quickly we're willing to divorce someone, to kick them out of the movement or to leave the movement, not over any particularly core theological point, but because of the way someone voted. And it just strikes me as a really sad moment in the church's life. And I think a lot of this it's not a fresh insight, that a lot of this is driven by social media. So until social media goes away, or until there's another technology that allows us to somehow transcend the bitterness, the small-mindedness, the viciousness of social media, I don't have a whole lot of hope for churches except in pockets that are going to be able to do this. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned earlier that, and I haven't read it, you just because you mentioned it, that you had like done a book looking at the way in which Rob Bell functioned, and like his changes in his career, the way in that kind of a moment of intense reflection that pops up when Love Wins comes out, and I would be interested if you had, like, to share a bit about that, looking back at it at this point, because I was talking to a couple friends the other day, and they're both charismatic ministers, so that's a little different than evangelical on what they get. They're sticklers on, but they both had this idea that Rob was one of the most successful evangelicals, in that he has managed to get into different platforms and different audiences and build different relationships. And for those that kind of frequently engage in his, like his content in his podcast and stuff, he's like re-articulating engagements with scripture and stuff in ways that you don't have to have grown up in the church or necessarily already like label yourself Christian to end up, engaging in stories in scripture and stuff like that. It's like, how does in one sense, a success in the getting new ears to hear what you're proclaiming thing connect to the particular parts of what he's doing that makes more evangelicals uncomfortable?
Yeah, I suppose you'd have to make a distinction between, I'm not sure how to label the distinction, but let me just talk about that. Rob has done a good job of introducing to a larger audience than evangelical. In fact, I don't know if many evangelicals listen to them. So a non-evangelical audience, to consider the reality of a transcendent reality, of a spiritual reality that hovers in with and under us all the time. Whether to use his language and stories to, in a sense, reach out to people who actually want this to be the case and are finding a voice in him to say, yeah, there is a reality beyond the material. There is a reality beyond the skeptical and the angry culture that we're a part of. It's more hopeful. There is something called love that kind of transcends all this. That's not just a human emotion, but it comes from something beyond us. So I see the same sort of thing in the psychology professor at the University of Toronto, Jordan Peterson.
Mm-hmm.
Who is are you familiar with him?
Yeah.
So I've seen him described as a Christian in an article about him. I've never heard him actually own up to that. But so much of what he says corresponds to Christian metaphysics, essentially. And he does it in a way, he uses evolutionary, scientific evolution, along with Freudian and Jungian psychoanalysis, to essentially make a case for the presence of the transcendent in life. And so I can imagine many people who come out of a secular, academic, materialist, especially Marxist and postmodern worldview, hearing him and going, oh my gosh, the world's bigger than I imagined. And so these type of speakers, it seems to me, in the grand scheme, if I may speak from the point of view of God for a moment, that God uses these people to help them move in their journey toward what I call a more concrete expression of faith as we find in Jesus Christ, as the church has taught throughout the ages. So I won't deny that in some mysterious way God uses these people for this sort of, and it's a powerful and positive thing in that regard. If it gets them to move, in fact, as I listened to one set of lectures by Peterson, people who would ask him questions would often say, well, I've just become a Christian, and I can't help it, and they asked him a question. I can't help but think that they were helped in their journey by listening to Peterson. Or another person, he says, I'm a Coptic Orthodox Christian. he's attending a lecture by Peterson because there's something about Peterson that resonates deeply with Coptic Orthodox. So I don't want to deny that what Peterson or Bell are doing does not have some fruitful outcome. I just think it's a bad way for the church to do theology. Because for the church has to do theology in order to inform its preaching. And its preaching strikes me as has a different task. Preaching is to the church, to believers, to help them go out in the world and be maybe like Peterson and Bell. But it seems to me the purpose of preaching is different than what Bell and...
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that the podcast Homebrewed Christianity that I run, I've been doing it almost 10 years, and I recently just moved from LA back to North Carolina where I grew up. And we would, 7 or 8 times a year would do the podcast live at different local breweries in Los Angeles. And one time I was interviewing Rob for it, but most of the people that come to this are not evangelicals, so they don't know who the guy is.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, these are scholars, and Tripp's a minister who interviews them, and we try craft beer, and then we do group singing. So after it, a couple of my friends who are comedy writers come up to me, and Rob's there, and they go, hey, Tripp, I want to meet your friend. He's really good. Hey, Rob, you're really good. Have you ever thought about preaching? Like, I grew up fundamentalist, and I don't really like that, but then I was hanging out with Tripp, and it seems like there are Christians that like science and that kind of stuff. So if you ever think about wanting to start a church, you should think about it, because I think you could be pretty good at it. And they don't know who he is. And Rob's like, oh, thanks. That's a great compliment. Preaching's a real art that takes a lot of work. And they're like, yeah, just so, if you do, Tripp, just let us know. And and I just remember going, oh, that's something. Because and I wonder if there's it makes me think of, what does that admonition that Barth does, like that you have scripture in one hand and newspaper in another, like what does that connect to this kind of conversation that you're wanting to have around, like the task of preaching and it being to the church? So like as we move into a kind of more post-Christian situation, and Christians are developing a more, insular type of or inward focus when it comes to our self-reflection, and like, how do we negotiate using language and images that are only understood after you're in-house long enough and biblically literate to using other ones, and how do we draw lines or figure out how to negotiate with integrity, sharing a tradition, keeping it alive, and not just pure repetition, but also like being a steward of it to the next generation and to an audience that doesn't inherit the cultural inertia of Christendom.
Well, I do think, so you've asked a huge question, so let me just react based on the things that occurred to me as you were asking. So one, I think what the preacher says to a congregation, I might have to backpedal and just think about what is the relationship between the word we preach to a congregation and the word we preach to the world. It might be the same word. I mean, Barth would certainly think it is. It's certainly a proclamation of what God has done in Jesus Christ. I mean, that's sort of what the gospel is. And that's where I would want to start is the gospel is about what God has done. We are in a world that's fascinated with what's going on inside of us. So we can't help, we're going to have to talk about that. But it seems to me the church's first message right now should be, no, this is what God has done. This is what God has done in Jesus Christ. The thing I love about Peterson's, like his exposition of Genesis,
mm-hmm.
the deeply psychological analysis of Genesis. So it's pretty interesting in parts, especially his discussion of what's going on between Cain and Abel. Fascinating.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know that that's what Genesis is about, actually. So I do think somebody needs to somewhere say, Genesis is telling something about God, first and foremost. The Gospels are telling us something about Jesus Christ, first and foremost. And secondarily, they may be telling us something about anthropology, about us. But first and foremost, we have to find out what it's telling us about God, and especially God and Jesus Christ, because we can't actually understand our psychology until we understand who Jesus Christ is, the true man. We can't understand human psychology until we understand the true man at some level. So I think there's something to be said there. Second, I do think Christianity has a unique vocabulary, and you can't really be a deep or mature Christian without understanding that vocabulary and imbibing that vocabulary. In other words, evangelicals are fond of saying, well, I'm just changing the words so that they're more easily apprehended by a non-believing, non-religious audience. And I say, well, that might be useful up to a point, but the fact of the matter is if you use different words to talk about the gospel, you end up talking about a different gospel. That's all there is to it. And the reason why the church has this history of a certain set of words that in fact have a deep and profound meaning, not only in terms of our history, but also in terms of theology. You cannot, for example, you can't become a really good fisherman. I'm a fly fisherman, unless you start learning about the difference between a fly rod and a fishing pole.
Mm-hmm.
You can't, unless you know the different names of the different flies. If you don't know the different widths of the type of tippet you use, or you'll be interested in this. I'm a home brewer myself, and you're not going to be able to talk to other home brewers unless you learn a certain technical vocabulary about mashes and mash tuns and hydrometers and refractometers and all this goes into. You just will never be able to have an intelligent conversation with one another unless you learn the vocabulary and know specifically what it means.
But you want them to learn sanitation and fermentation temperature control first. Because then it doesn't matter what you put in. If you don't do those two things, it tastes like butterscotch.
Yeah. And you may, and you're introducing brewing to another group of people who are kind of interested in brewing, you're not going to assault them with all the technical vocabulary. You're going to say, well, during this first part of the process, it converts carbohydrates into sugars, which allows the yeast to convert it into alcohol. They don't want to know any more than that. They don't need to know any more than that. But then at some point, as a brewer, you're going to have to know a little bit more than that. You're going to make a good batch of beer. So the same thing goes with Christian theology. So I think there is a place, and the church is the place, where you're introduced to the vocabulary that's absolutely necessary for you to grow up into the full stature of Christ. But when we step out into the world, I think you're absolutely right. We can't just start using the vocabulary. We can't just say, God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, not counting their sins against them. They just, what the heck are you talking about? So we do have to talk in language that they can comprehend, knowing the risk of doing that. That as soon as we do that, we're probably altering the gospel in some way, and that hopefully with God's grace, we'll be able to alter it back once we get deeper into the faith. But I don't think you can get away from that tension.
Well, and one of the things I think that makes that complicated and messy, and I can't remember which time, but one of the times N.T. Wright was on the podcast, he said that one of the difficulties for Christian leaders today is that we're now aware that even using the same words doesn't always communicate the same thing anymore, right? Like when we say sin or God or whatever, these words that are in Scripture, we know like Romans was understood really differently by Paul and the Romans who received it than Luther when he received it, and yet a lot of us are more Lutheran than we are, Paul. And so there's this necessary kind of hermeneutical engagement that takes place on both sides that makes that real complicated. And I wonder how many times it's not easier just to keep using the same words but not know whether or not we're communicating the same thing anymore.
No, I agree with you 100% on that. That's exactly right. So take the example of sin, or you can pick the word evangelical. Right now, it has a pretty much political, cultural meaning in our culture. And so when you use it with a group of people, you're stepping onto a landmine. Actually, the word evangelical, as you well know, has a very deep and profoundly important meaning. Mm-hmm. You could say the same thing about sin. So I do think one of the ongoing tasks is to continue to use the vocabulary, but to use it intelligently. And so that requires, it's more complicated than just saying, well, we can't just say people are broken. We can't just say people have missed the mark. We really do have to use the word sin. Sin is a really important word. But then we also have to say, okay, the Bible means different things by it sometimes. And how Paul understood it and how Luther understood it are different. It has different dimensions. We have learned through Christian history, it has deeper and more profound dimensions than we had imagined when Paul was writing. But I still would insist that the word sin is bigger than we imagine. And you're right, absolutely right. And I think this is the weakness of some evangelical theologians is that, or maybe not theologians, certainly pastors and teachers, is they think they've done their job once they've used the vocabulary, which you will. The first step of the job, but it's not the complete job.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I'm interested in how you kind of diagnose or see this is one of the things, having done over 1,000 interviews in the last 10 years from people kind of all over the church, but they're all academics generally. So, professors that like in LA, I would do with professors at Fuller and at Claremont and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Is what issues different parts of the church discuss with me when I stop hitting record, right? So progressive mainline Protestants are not going to talk on the podcast that much about their personal piety, prayer, or any uniquely Christocentric things about themselves. I've been shocked at meals when now I'm a Baptist preacher's kid from the South who did mostly progressive Protestant education, which meant I was always the token conservative in the room because I knew I read my Bible every day. So I've been to find out that John Cobb, Mr. Process Theology, is the most, he's a Methodist missionary kid, but he has the piety every evangelical thinks of, gets up, reads his Bible, prays in the name of Jesus at meals, unless someone there that it's going to be too awkward to welcome them into the shared practice of gratitude to God before eating. Things you're shocked about. That's not going to be on his book. But then, and their stated fears about what the older generation around what happened when their students that are ministers picked up their theology, it became mostly political and progressive social engagement. They'll say stuff like that. But when it goes to evangelical ones, I'm surprised how many of them will say things that signal we know the end's coming for really fighting about sexuality and stuff like that, or having a kind of more inclusivist view of salvation. The two issues around sexuality and pluralism, they'll talk more about it, not, on the record, and will say things like that more and more of their students are just at home with, gay Christian friends or Muslim neighbors and that type of thing. And I always wonder, thinking of, you said at the beginning, one of the things you really loved about Barth is he was an extremist. So you don't have to have any ambiguity about what he believes. He was going to just, stay it and go for it. What do you think the context is or situation where issues around religious pluralism and the sexuality arguments and stuff kind of move past conversations that are off the record and you see different changes to a more straightforward conversation that happens within evangelicalism rather than those being ones that are kind of more boundary statements?
So you're asking what are evangelicals talking about behind closed doors, about trends they see or they fear?
Oh no, the number of tenured theology professors at evangelical schools that I know would say people in other religious traditions will be redeemed by God and are affirming of gay members in congregations and the life of the church and stuff, but won't say it out in public. And then we'll say things about more of their students are, or we're getting there, and it's this progress thing. And part of it is because they, at least my intuition is, they see it as more of a conversation of whether you're in or out of evangelicalism right now, but see it becoming one evangelicals can have on their own as evangelicals.
I see. No, I don't see. Stop me if I'm not answering what you're asking, but I think take the issue of human sexuality. I do think there is a large segment of evangelicals, not large, back up. There is a segment of evangelicals, certainly in higher education, but also on the ground, who are happy to move in a more progressive direction. They're not quite sure what the fuss is about, and they would be happy to move in that direction. I think evangelicalism, as we understand in America today, has pretty much rejected them. That is to say, if you want to be progressive on your view of that, you you probably aren't an evangelical. No one's actually come out and said that, but various things have happened in the last couple of years that have indicated that's kind of a boundary marker for evangelicals. And I don't think that's going anywhere anytime soon. That is to say, evangelicals who find themselves who's the woman blogger, Evans.
Rachel Held Evans?
She found herself going to an Episcopal church now. And that makes perfect sense, given her views on human sexuality. That's fine. But I think what you're going to find is a drifting toward the main line of those people because they find it more compatible home for them. But that won't change evangelicalism because evangelicalism has fairly high standards when it comes to sexual morality. Or let's put it this way. There will always be a group of Christians who, as I talked about, who will identify with the quadrilateral of Bebbington, who have a deep, what I call Augustinian piety, both in terms of its anxiety about the state of their souls and the state of the world, and its how they find redemption in Jesus Christ and the substitutionary atonement, who will have fairly conservative moral practices, including conservative sexual practices. This group of people will always be around. So to say that, and for people who don't find that a cogent or coherent way to be a Christian, they're going to drift to other ways of being a Christian. But in terms of this thing I'm calling evangelicals, that label right now, that's just not going anywhere. And the same would apply to kind of a universalism. Those who are more attracted to a more universalist point of view that everyone is saved, no matter what, they're going to make their way to mainline in Unitarian churches. That's kind of what they do. But there will always be a group that say, no, Jesus' words about that are kind of clear. There is some sort of decision to be made, and Christ is very clear that there are people that are in and they're out. It's just really hard. I mean, I would say emotionally I'm a universalist. I'd say I wish it were true, but I keep reading Jesus, and he seems to indicate it isn't true. So I keep on as an evangelical, getting forced back into a kind of a classical Orthodox understanding. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I do hear those conversations, but I don't think it's a threat to this Augustinian piety that, as I said, has been with us and will continue to be with us for centuries to come until the Lord comes.
Well, I mean, one of the reasons I find it interesting is how especially around the sexuality part, is that it has certain hermeneutical assumptions in how you interpret scripture, not whether or not it's authoritative, but how you understand its reading and what it's communicating, that are less and less persuasive the higher up the academic guild you get, unlike something like God redeemed the world in Jesus or something like that. And one of the things that's happened just in doing this podcast is how many ministers reach out and say, like, here's where I am on this issue, but there's zero chance I want to go to a UCC church. Like, at the end of my sermons, I ask people if they want to ask Jesus in their heart. So I don't really belong in the mainline Protestant congregation. And I think it's a growing number. And the number of them that I interact with who are, teaching future evangelical ministers in the academy and also preaching to thousands every Sunday is high. And I wonder if there's a way or a situation where those are not so much boundary issues as not like a congregation doesn't have convictions, but that the tent of evangelicalism is big enough. A lot of people that are already in it can just be honest about their convictions there and discuss it.
No. I mean, if they start discussing those particular issues in those particular ways, I think the reason why they're not talking about them out loud in front of God and everybody, because they very well know that the community called evangelicalism is going to say, no, we're not. This isn't where we're at. Mm-hmm. Just sorry. I mean, and it doesn't surprise me that there are people in boundary situations and living boundary moments, and they live those moments for 10, 20, 30 years. Because these sort of things take a while to sort out. I mean, after not that I'm comparing the importance of this particular issue with the Nicene Creed, but it's not a bad parallel. After the promulgation of Nicene Creed, there were still Arian churches all over the world. There were, in fact, the best missionaries in the early church often were Arian missionaries. So this sort of thing doesn't sort itself out immediately or quickly by any stretch of the imagination. And there's a lot of boundary crossing and confusion along the way. But we look at that situation now, almost 1,700 years later, and we say the Arians were clearly wrong-headed about that, and the Orthodox were right. Now, did that get sorted out in 383? Was it 383 or 387? Well, formally, yeah, but actually on the ground, no. It took centuries upon centuries for that to get sorted out. So I think that's where we're at in terms of issues of human sexuality and issues of universal redemption. I think there's going to be a lot of confusion. Not confusion quite isn't the word I'm looking for, but maybe it is. I don't mean to say these people are confused. I mean, they don't seem to fit in neat categories right now.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, I definitely think that's true. And I've just always, like, I don't know. My wife and I are both ordained Baptists, and I've only worked at one Baptist church just because more of them don't have ordained women involved. And unless you're in a certain part of the country, we can't even have our daughter go to a church where her mother's who is ordained will be preaching from the pulpit. And it just and so we've ended up at churches where the Sunday school teachers are uncomfortable with how biblically literate our children are. And because we still have family Bible and prayer time at night every day. So
realizes that some of the comments you have suggested imply a kind of a progressive view of history, that it's always moving in one direction, especially on the issues that we find most interesting and most important. And of course, any reading of church history suggests that history is not necessarily moving in one direction or another. There are these repeated themes that come up time again about which people have to sort themselves out. So I think that's part of what's going on here as well.
So if you could magically turn dials of attentiveness to the readers of Christianity Today and things, where you're seeing stories proposed and topics to reflect on and wrestle with and things, and you want to be able to hit the magic retweet button in their imagination so they do give more time and attention to these issues that you wish the church was paying more attention, and turn down dials to some others. Where, as someone connected to so many different parts of American Christianity, do you think we should be spending more time and attention?
Well, I would. It would probably get back to my book on Barth, and that, as you've probably discussed many times on your podcast, American evangelicalism is infected with what has been termed moral therapeutic deism. Mm-hmm. So often what we hear from the pulpit is some version of that gospel. That is a thin gospel. It's a terrible gospel. It's actually not bad preaching in the sense of being more Proverbs type wisdom preaching. I mean, a lot of the preaching is very good about helping people live productive, effective, being in their family and community. They just often have very little to do with the gospel. I mean, Joe Osteen would be a prime example to me. When I've listened to Osteen, I can't really find much that he says that isn't actually kind of true. It's just that it's so thin, and it's always about how we can have a more happy life, which is what kind of Proverbs is about. So I would want to, and when I do hear Scripture exegeted, there's an attempt to use the Bible as a foundation and go a little deeper. It often is just such a superficial addressing of the scripture themes that it's actually stunning to me how paltry it is sometimes. Mm-hmm. So I'd want to. This is some of my friends in the Gospel Coalition. When I heard a sermon by Mark Dever in Washington D.C., and I read the website the night before that the sermon was going to be 45 minutes, and I thought, oh my gosh, well, that's my job. I have to go there. It was the most riveting exposition of Genesis 1 through 4 I ever heard. It was delightful to hear him just get into the text like that. And I guess I would hope for a resurrection of serious expository preaching. It could do us a world of good.
Yeah. So You mentioned earlier about technology really affecting the way we're able to discuss and interact and things, which is one of the reasons I like podcasts more than like Facebook and Twitter and things, because those tend to be short missiles you send somewhere, and in an hour-long conversation where you could talk about multiple topics and go back and forth, interact, and you get the experience of two humans wanting to share, listen, and interact. That the number of hour-long conversations I have every week, half of them I'm recording for the internet, and I think that's a sad fact about how many few hour-long conversations we have. So when you think of the type of conversations that you think faith leaders should be having with their peers, not like in public, not like with their congregation, not like that, but what are the conversations that or maybe the patterns and relationships you see that are helping leaders act with more integrity and faithfulness in a context where a lot of the new technologies are pushing and promoting the worst instincts of us and our congregants?
Yeah, I do think the idea of physically getting together is super important. I guess I would say it kind of may seem contradictory, but it seems to me it would be important to have it at two levels. The temptation for pastors when they get together was to share tips on how to grow their churches, which is all well and good, but it strikes me that they might be better informed by simply talking to each other about what it means to be a human being right now, what it means to be. So you're our pastor. And we always, when I was a pastor, people would say, well, you can't wrap your personhood up in your pastoring. And I go, well, I thought about that and realized it can't happen. A pastor is a different type of person. So you have to be with other people that are pastors and you talk about things differently and you think about things, you experience things differently as such. And you have to have a group of men or men and women to be able to just to be able to talk and just be with each other. When I was a pastor, we went to an annual conference up at Mount Hermon in California, in which, we would invite the Eugene Petersons and other great speakers to come in. But frankly, what the conference was about was in between those times and the times we would go out for pizza and beer afterwards and just be with each other. That was more energizing and inspiring than any other thing we got from the conference. But the other thing would be another switch I would like to be able to flip is, can pastors begin to learn to talk about theology with one another again? I sound like an old man, but when I was younger, all the model preachers were pastor theologians. In California, it was Earl Palmer. He was the pastor of First Presbyterian in Berkeley. It was Richard Halverson in Washington. There were others who you could tell they were teachers of the word and pastoral theologians. Mm-hmm. And they were our models. Now the best known preachers are entrepreneurs. They're brilliant men and mostly men, but at building organizations. They're absolutely genius about that. But in many cases, their preaching is sort of predictable and not very deep, and they're not encouraging a life of the mind. I think we do that really well right now. We do the practical really well. What we're not doing well and what we're not thinking about is, the way Bonhoeffer put it is, what does Jesus Christ mean for us today? Mm-hmm. And I think they would do well to, after talking about things they need prayer for, to then talk with one another. What does Jesus Christ want for our community today, and how can we as churches do that?
So if someone was going to talk you into writing another biography,
that's a really good question.
Who would it be?
Well, they wouldn't have to talk me into it. I would have to talk a publisher into it. I'd love to do a biography of John Chrysostom. Oh. Again, it's because the arc of his life story, again, is so interesting. He comes out as a preacher during a crisis in Antioch when the town is cowering in fear because they feel like the Roman government's going to come down, put punishment on them because there was a riot there that desecrated some of the Roman statues. He has battles with Eudoxia, Empress of Constantinople when he gets kidnapped to become the court chaplain there. It's just a really interesting person people should know more about. Plus, he's a theologian in his own right, as well as a liturgist. Would anyone want to read that book? I doubt it. So that would be one. I was toying with the idea of doing a biography of Karl Henry, founder of Christianity Today, the other night. I don't know if there was enough story there to write a biography. I wouldn't want to do a biography of a theologian with a story attached with it, because otherwise just do the introduction to his theology. Why do the biography part?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm waiting and looking for ideas of books that a publisher might actually publish.
Well, it is always good to write a book that gets published. Those are
and then gets actually bought and read, because it's a heck of a lot of work, and you hope somebody would find it helpful in some way.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining and talking and sharing and thinking out loud. Is there anything we haven't talked about, or a place you want to direct people to be able to connect with you?
Well, of course, let me say a couple of things. First of all, I appreciate your podcast and what you're doing on the podcast. Just to show you how that I'm committed to this enterprise that you are a part of, is that I meet weekly with a group of men. We decided to live in, because there'd be a men's group as well as theology, that we call Brewing Theology, in which the two requirements are that you bring 2 beers to share, but that you also read the passage under discussion, and we're usually reading some work of theology to discuss with one another, because we think it's a really important, in a sense, spiritual discipline to be together to discuss these things. And of course, often it ends up being about things personal. And we're the kind of nerdy guys, like you said, that if we're having a problem in our marriage, we usually think the first thing we think of is, so what is my theology of marriage?
Understood.
Maybe I should help around the house more, So I do commend what you're doing, and I will do a better job of making sure people know about your podcast. In terms of where they can connect with me, is I publish something called the Galli Report every week. It can be found in the last spelling of the last name is Galli. The Galli Report, ChristianityToday.com/Galli Report is where you can find it and subscribe to it. And what I do there is I link to articles of interest that I've read during the week. I comment on them, 4 or 5 articles a week, and a lot of people find that a pretty helpful commentary. And if you might want to try it, if you find it helpful, subscribe. Yeah.
And last question is, what is your favorite homebrew recipe? Like if you're getting ready for Thanksgiving or the time where you make beer that you're going to share with friends, and they're going to be like, oh, that's your jam. What's the style recipe?
Well, speaking of marriage, I always have to have an IPA on tap for my wife. She will drink nothing else.
Oh, that just sounds like an excellent wife.
But then for this special beer, I always try to have a bourbon stout of one sort or another ready for Thanksgiving, Christmas. In fact, I just bottled one this weekend.
Uh-oh.
So, and this one, my kids got me a bourbon cask a few years ago for Christmas, and I've used it every year since. And it just makes it's really, it doesn't speak much of my brewing skills, because it's really hard to make a bad stout, especially when it's anywhere from 10 to 13%.
Yes.
It's really
I like to call that flavorful light beer, because you don't need a 6-pack.
No, you don't. In fact, I tell people you don't want a whole beer. You just want to split this with someone.
Yeah.
It's just way too much, yeah. But if there is of it, it's so good. It's incredible. So
that's awesome. When Phyllis Tickle's last big speaking tour, when she was at Fuller Seminary, she wanted to do the podcast, but they don't serve alcohol on their campus. So the UCC church, which Fuller Seminary surrounds.
I went to Fuller, so I know that.
So we do the podcast immediately after her lecture at the UCC church, and they come in, and it was and I made a peanut butter chocolate porter in Jack Daniels barrels because she's a huge Jack Daniels drinker, and it turned out to be so delicious. I've made it a number of times since then, but yeah, I was like, okay, well, it's Phyllis Tickle. You can buy an old Jack Daniels barrel right now, and it's kind of cheating. You make a beer that's B plus, and then it goes in a bourbon barrel, and you're like,
all of a sudden it's another,
You're like, I taste like a professional.
Exactly. So that's the nice thing about making darker beers. It is hard to ruin them. The lighter the beer, I find it the harder to make. I struggle with lagers. I have really struggled to make a good lager. I finally have a good Oktoberfest that I've made a couple years in a row now, but my lagers have been so-so.
Yeah, they're definitely harder to do. I hadn't made ones I enjoyed drinking till I had a whole fridge dedicated to fermentation and with the controller. So if the lager starts to warm even on the inside of the beer, it cranks the temperature down. Yeah,
I have that now too. You're right. You're absolutely right about sanitation and temperature control. It's hard to not make a drinkable beer doing that. That's for sure.
Unless you let a new home brewer pick the recipe. That's another thing. Like there's a reason really famous beers have a lot of recipes that are similar. It's because it tastes good. Exactly. No one when they make their first homemade pizza is like, hey, have y'all thought about sticking sliced pork tongue on the pizza? No one does that. But a home brewer would.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, okay, fair enough.
Well, hopefully hopefully we will end up at the same place in the future, and we can find high quality craft beverages nearby.
That sounds great. I really enjoyed this time. Thank you very much.
Do you go to AAR?
No, not too much. Usually I have some staff person here at those, so that would be Caleb Lundgren. So if you see him there at CT, be sure to say hello. Yeah.
All righty. Will do.
Thank you.
It was fun.